These people are religious. They're offended by perceived insults to their faith, and in order to defend their beliefs, they're willing to take to the streets with guitars.
What if someone, did feel genuinely that religion was inherently ridiculous and was setting out to mock it with a view towards and hopefully dismantling it? How would you feel about that?
Well, but at the end of the day, either Christianity is true or it isn't.
Oh, right.
If it's true, you can't dismantle it.
Yeah, so basically it would stand or fall by
absolutely.
You
don't need to protect God. God is either God or he's not.
Britain is one of the most secular societies in the world. Church attendance has never been lower. Most people never see the inside of a church except for weddings and funerals. But increasingly, religious protesters and lobbyists attempt to dictate what we can and cannot say and do. We like to think we live in a tolerant liberal country where people are free to speak their minds, where we're all grown-ups, artists aren't censored, and books aren't burned.
If I'm not respectful to religion, then people shouldn't vote for me.
Right.
They shouldn't like me.
Yeah.
They shouldn't do what I tell them to do, but I shouldn't be prosecuted.
I don't believe in God. Thousands of people do. They might be right, okay? But even if you don't believe in God, the idea that you have offended a super being is quite intimidating.
My name is Stuart Lee. I'm a stand-up comedian and a writer. You've probably not heard of me, but I normally get good reviews in broadsheet newspapers, and I can pull about 150 people in a provincial arts centre on a Tuesday night. By my association with Jerry Springer the Opera, I observed at first hand the power of religious censorship in Britain today.
Stand up, Lord Jesus, the trumpet call obey.
Behind me are some Christians from Liverpool protesting against the performance of Richard Thomas's Jerry Springer the Opera, which I co-wrote and directed. On opening nights, there's usually as many as 1,000, but tonight, it's Tuesday, Question of Sport is on, and the weather's quite nice.
The closing third of the opera restaged an American talk show in hell, where the tensions inherent in the Christian myth played out as if they were everyday human problems. Religious stories have been used to address secular concerns for centuries, from medieval mystery plays to Milton's Paradise Lost, and positive reviews in the Church Times and the Catholic Herald reflected this.
So he walked across the f***ing seas. So you got yourself crucified. Here's a little biscuit from me.
The opera played in theatres for 3 years. Critics loved it, and it was described as the most important piece of music theatre for 35 years. But when the BBC announced a TV screening, the sky fell on our heads. Christians who hadn't even seen the show took offence at its imagined content.
What do we want? Jerry up! What do we want?
And evangelical leaders lied about the play, misinterpreting its imagery and ideas to serve their own political ends. They said that we portrayed Jesus as a sexual deviant dressed in a nappy. Now that's a pretty funny idea, but it wasn't actually true.
I want your love and your respect.
But whether you think of the people behind me as hysterical bigots or well-intentioned fools, they are nonetheless divs. But divs who managed to bring an acclaimed theatre production to its knees, generate 65,000 complaints in advance of a screening, send BBC executives into hiding, and prevent venues all over the country from taking the show. Divs that give an indication of the extent of the power of religious protest in Britain today.
People have the right to be offended, and they have the right to protest against a play or an article that has caused them offence. What they don't have is a right to take the law into their own hands, or even to suggest that there should be a law to limit a speech that's merely offensive.
This is a leaflet protesting the show, full of out-of-context quotes, reactionary invective, and a photo of me looking like the devil. It's produced by Christian Institute, whose charitable status was questioned in Parliament recently after it was revealed that they spent £20,000 of tax-free money on a newspaper advert protesting against same-sex partnerships.
Insults on leaflets are like holy water off a duck's back, but the protest did work.
if it's clearly advertised, this may be offensive, don't watch it, or it's a play where people have to pay to go into, then I don't think there should be any restrictions around respect for other people. I said to the people protesting at the BBC when BBC Two put on your musical, this is a hand control, a remote, use it, turn over. Don't seek to stop other people from watching it.
Jerry Springer the Opera played to packed houses at the National Theatre in London, but its chances of reaching a wider audience all around the country were reduced by fanatical right-wing Christian opposition. A benefit performance for a cancer charity was also cancelled after their hospice was threatened with Christian picketing. There was talk of the composer and I being prosecuted for blasphemy, but ultimately the case was not pursued, presumably on the grounds that it isn't 1508. We may not have been burned at the stake, but sadly our souls remain in danger.
I was getting all this kind of hate mail all the time, and it still goes on now, and it was quite distressing, but I did get one funny one in March last year where someone wrote to me and they said, "I enjoyed listening to you defend your work on Radio 5 yesterday. You seem like a very intelligent and thoughtful young man. What a pity you'll be going to hell."
I can still remember the first time I found religion funny. It was at primary school when our headmaster told us a story about how God always answers our prayers.
Once upon a time there was a little girl. Her mother told her that God loved her and that he would always answer her prayers. The little girl had eyes of the darkest brown, but she didn't want them. She wanted blue eyes. So that night, she prayed to God, "Dear God, please let me have blue eyes." But in the morning, when she awoke, her eyes were still brown. The next evening, she prayed to God again, "Dear God, please let me have blue eyes." But when she awoke in the morning, her eyes were still brown. And the third night, the little girl prayed to God again, "Dear God, please, please, can I have blue eyes?" But when she awoke again, as usual, her eyes were still brown. And the little girl said to her mother, "Mother, you told me that God loved me and would always answer my prayers. But the last 3 nights I've prayed to him to have blue eyes, and still in the morning, my eyes are brown. So God did not answer my prayers." And her mother said, "Oh, my child, God did answer your prayers. But on this occasion, his answer was no." I was only 8 years old when I first laughed at the absurdity of that little religious fable, and I've found religion funny ever since. Also beautiful, sometimes inspiring, and occasionally sublime, but I'm afraid also irrational and funny.
See him for 1 minute, but not 1 second more. Do you understand? Yes. Promise?
There's a long and inglorious history of religious fundamentalists taking offence at satire. They were up in arms back in 1979 when Monty Python released Life of Brian, a beautifully sculpted biblical epic that somehow manages to make a thoughtful and insightful look at the nature of belief hilarious.
You don't need to follow me. You don't need to follow anybody. You've got to think for yourselves. You're all individuals. Yes, we're all individuals. You're all different. Yes, we are all different. I'm not.
10 years later, Salman Rushdie published the Satanic Verses, and suddenly it really wasn't funny anymore. In Iran, Rushdie was sentenced to death in a fatwa, or religious ruling issued by the Ayatollah Khomeini for insulting Islam. A Japanese translator of the Satanic Verses was murdered in 1991, and scores of people died in protests in India and Pakistan. In Turkey, 37 people died in 1993 when a hotel was set alight by angry Muslim protesters. In 2005, Sikh protesters forced the play Beheshti off the stage of a theatre in Birmingham. Beheshti was written by a Sikh woman and, set in a Sikh temple, it dealt with the role of women in that community. The protesters' fury sent the playwright into hiding.
I think there's a concerted effort by religious conservatives in many religions to protect themselves, and I would, if I was one of those, I would do it, okay, because they know how vulnerable they are to satire and criticism. So there's a concerted effort to restrict free speech. It's in their interest. It's not just one of these things that's happening.
Religious fundamentalists of all shapes and sizes are becoming more vociferous in their attacks, as if competing to see who can be the most upset. But some believers think satire is healthy for the development of religious debate. The Reverend Simon Stevens is one, and when he agreed to talk to me, I was as happy as the editor of the Daily Mail when he finds a black pundit to complain about immigration. For a moment, I thought there was a God.
When the Christian Voice organisation complained about Jerry Springer the Opera being on television, the head guy talked about how he felt that when they protested about this play, Beheshti in Birmingham, the Sikhs had stolen a march on them.
Yeah,
Do you think there's a kind of escalation between different groups of...
Yeah, and I feel that a lot of the Christian response to things like Jerry Springer the Opera is coloured by Muslim offence and Hindu offence. So in a sense, we want to prove that we love God as much as they do. So let's be just as offended as they are. I've actually had people saying that things like, well, of course, if you'd done that to Muslims, they'd have issued, a death sentence against you, as if, like, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the fact that the Archbishop of Canterbury doesn't issue fatwas, is somehow a bad thing.
He's weak.
He's
a weak, cowardly man.
So, let's get some more fatwas out there, then they'll respect the Church of England.
In October 2005, more angry protests resulted from the publication in Denmark of cartoons which made clumsy jokes about Islam.
The Danish cartoons was, I think, a really explosive scenario. I think that a certain amount of the long-term offence that was caused and some of the violent protests all over the world were really manufactured. As a campaigner myself, I know that there are very few spontaneous protests in the world of campaigning. So there's definite mischief on the part of some people who wanted to stir up a clash of civilisations, who mixed new, even more offensive cartoons with the original cartoons, who took them around the Middle East to stir up hatred. I think that was a definite mischief.
When Muslim protests began to spread across Europe, newspapers had to decide whether the artistic value of the cartoons outweighed the risk of violent reprisals. As a safety measure, I'm reading this voiceover wearing a cycling helmet.
Do you think that the Danish cartoons of Mohammed would have been easier to defend had they been better? They're not hugely funny.
One of the problems about censorship has always been that you end up defending rubbish, or whether it's rubbish porno movies. You're very rarely in the position, Lady Chatterley was an exception, of defending something that has any artistic merit, whatever.
Yeah.
And so you're a bit stuck. You look at this and say, would I have published those cartoons? Well, they were awful. They were horribly drawn.
Even bastions of free speech like The Guardian decided not to reprint the cartoons.
They had a nasty side to them, and they weren't funny.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it gave editors an out. It gave The Guardian an out to say, we wouldn't publish this anyway.
Yeah.
So the only point of publishing it would be in order to be provocative. Do we deliberately wish to be provocative? No. Can the police protect us? No.
Yeah.
And so, it was the better part of valour, but it left a lot of editors feeling very uncomfortable and a lot of readers feeling very uncomfortable because it was intimidation.
Followers of faiths other than Christianity complain that there's an inbuilt unfairness in the system as it stands. The blasphemy laws only relate to the Church of England, the religion of the state. In January 2006, the government tried to introduce a new bill to remedy the situation. Liberal Democrat MP Evan Harris was one of many to oppose the Incitement to Racial and Religious Hatred Bill, which promised to protect all major religions.
Well, the government was quite explicit about this because I said, isn't it important that we allow people to speak freely without worrying about the criminal law, the criminal law? And the minister said, no, the part of the point of this bill, which we fortunately were able to defeat, was that people should think carefully before speaking. I don't see why. I mean, ministers very rarely do.
Yeah.
Why should they create laws to force us? I mean, it's recommended. I advise it. I try to do so, at least until this interview. Prepare what I'm going to say carefully. But I don't see why I should be forced by criminal sanction to think before I speak. When I'm not inciting violence, when I'm not defaming people, I'm just criticising strongly, in strong terms, as I want to, beliefs with which I find abhorrent.
Do you think we need to take seriously the notion that no one should have to be offended by anything? I mean, this seems to be another idea that's out in the ether at the moment. I have the right not to be offended.
There's absolutely no right not to be offended. I think we should all be polite and careful, but I don't think that should be advice backed by criminal law. Unless you're inciting violence, shouting fire in a theatre, public order, directly abusing someone, that's a public order offence, or inciting hatred against someone on the basis of their race.
The government warned writers and comedians that material considered reckless by the new law would lead to prosecution. But how do you define recklessness? Rowan Atkinson led the opposition.
And you may even decide, after much prayer, to enter into a committed and tempted relationship with a member of the same genital group.
Rowan Atkinson made his reputation on the 1980s show Not a 9 O'Clock News. And here, this gentle, almost affectionate satire of the Church of England's attitude to homosexuality was prophetic. 20 years later, the issue is in the process of splitting the Anglican Church worldwide, which will be a terrible loss to the discipline of flower arranging.
That God just wants you to have a rotten life. God's like that. He hates puffs.
The religious hatred bill was really the product of a great deal of lobbying for some time by the Muslim community, or the leaders of the Muslim community, I should make clear, who felt very much that there was a blasphemy law that covered Christianity. In fact, it only covers the Church of England, the established church. But they felt that religion is covered. Mainstream Christianity, and that there's no such thing in relation to Muslims. And it goes all the way back to the Salman Rushdie affair, where the whole business of book burning and the fatwa, because offence was taken about Salman Rushdie's book. And there was a call at that time for the blasphemy law to be extended to cover Islam.
If the bill had passed, the makers of the comedy series Goodness Gracious Me might even have ended up in the dock. One now rarely seen sketch parodied Asian stereotypes using some of white Christian Britain's traditional sacred cows.
The sketch was about some characters in the show, regular running characters, who called the Coopers. Yeah. They were actually called Kapoor, but they called themselves Cooper. The gag was they tried to be more British than the British and kept getting it wrong because they didn't really understand. So on that particular week, they were going to church, because that's what you do if you're English. Church of England, obviously.
Oh, yes. Marvellous. Give us 2 bottles.
And then he gives the wafer and says, Body of Christ, and one of them says, oh, disgusting, haven't you got any vol au vents? And goes off, in disgust.
Body of Christ.
And the last guy says, thank you very much, dips it in some chutney and eats it.
But then there was a payoff at the end, a clever satirical payoff.
There was a satirical payoff at the end, because the gag, again, is they're being really British, and they hate black people, or Pakis, was the.
The Right Reverend Bishop of Hounslow.
Oh, my God, the bishops are packed!
So who complained about it and what happened?
That particular episode, I think, was the #1 rated show on BBC Two that week.
Yeah.
So it got about 5 million viewers, and overnight, apparently, I can't remember exactly the numbers, but it was about 300 or so complaints were registered on the BBC phone log. And I got a phone call on the Saturday from my boss saying, right, you've had these complaints, the show is due to be repeated on the Sunday, and they said, you'll have to come in and cut that bit.
Right.
I said, this is surely a defensible thing, this is something we can argue. And the BBC weren't interested. They said, no, you will come in, you will cut it, that will be it.
Was the implication that you'd overstepped some
The implication was that somehow we oughtn't to be doing stuff about religions other than our own.
Yeah.
And I said, well, hang on a minute, we were all brought up in this country. I went to a state school. I had to attend my daily act of Christian worship as required by law.
Yeah.
So
you picked up a lot
what bit of it is about the Church of England am I not able to comment on?
Religious education at school. Surely that's one way of guaranteeing that we all develop an understanding of each other's religious background, thus ensuring greater social harmony.
Faith schools are going to be the worst disaster. We've already got 60 more since Labour came to power, with many more planned. It is absolutely fatal for community relations if you have all the Christians in one school, Muslims in another, Hindus in another.
Maybe the answer is some new religions, some new gods.
He was a snake with long blonde hair and ears and sleepy-looking eyes.
Yeah.
Looked disturbingly like Paris Hilton.
Oh, yeah.
Welcome to this avenue of trees where I have all my most profound thoughts. In the absence of any physical evidence of God or gods, religion remains an idea, but an idea nonetheless which exerts a powerful influence over everyday life, morality, social policy. Many of the world's most powerful leaders claim to be acting on behalf of God rather than the electorate. So religion has to remain open to discussion, whether that discussion takes the form of reasoned debate or sacrilegious satire.
For us, the use of religious figures in Jerry Springer the Opera was a means to an end, a way of taking a funny look at more important ideas like guilt and responsibility in human relationships. We never anticipated anyone would react so vociferously.
Thank God you're here.
There's no doubt that being at the receiving end of jokes or lampooning or satire about your religious beliefs, about any of your beliefs, even about your political beliefs, can be a pretty painful business. But it's always been very important in democracies that one can use those devices in some ways to prick the balloon of beliefs, because it is actually part of the great business of reaching towards truths that we have in our, if you like, our armoury of debate that we can at times make fun of someone's beliefs.
It's not as if doing comedy about religion is a new idea. Dave Allen was famous for making bawdy jokes about the Catholic Church and rarely looked more at home than when dressed as a man of the cloth. He later said he'd been able to diffuse the fury of an irate Catholic who accosted him by saying that this sketch featured the Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury rather than a good Catholic bishop.
I always feel that you know, especially in comedy, when offence walks a line, you know, what you're trying to do is you're trying to sort of say something. You know, I mean, in a sense, you know, if you send me up and you put a grain of truth in that, then, you know, then I may feel quite threatened, I may feel quite offended, but maybe it's something I need to hear. And I think, you know, what I have a problem with in terms of offence is, for instance, people who just lambast a minority for the sake of it.
What we mustn't do is cover religion in a special protection, because religion, like any other belief system, has to be held up to question. And that is what is so healthy about a democracy. And what we have to persuade new communities is that these values are good things. It's actually what makes living in Britain so terrific.
21st century Britain is home to a variety of different faiths. On any given day you can find modern Britons bowing to Mecca, chanting to Buddha, sacrificing insects and reptiles to Satan, even worshipping the water-walking, wine-making, leper-healing Jesus Christ himself. But what constitutes a legitimate religion?
Well, the government spent hours on producing a very lengthy answer which says it's up to the court.
It's up to the court.
That was their answer, and that was just saying that. And again, that doesn't build confidence, because that implies that you're taken all the way to the police station, all the way to the Crown Prosecution Service, all the way to the plea, and then it's up to the jury. Unless the Attorney General, this was their answer, would step in at the last minute, thank you very much, Mr. Politician, and say, you know, in the same way as he said the war in Iraq was legal, that this is okay to prosecute or not. And I don't think our freedoms, particularly at the end of such a process, should be decided by a politician. It wasn't even leaving it to the judges, and that's bad enough.
Yeah.
The only definition of what a religion is comes under charity law, where the Charity Commission has to decide which side of the line. And they decided that the pagans weren't, because they believed in a whole host of deities in nature, but the Odin worshippers were, because Odin was the king god. And that was okay. So they made that absurd distinction.
I wasn't aware of that. That's fantastic.
It's very good.
So you can get charitable status if you have
head of your clan of gods, but if they're diffuse...
If they're diffuse and they live in trees and bushes, you're done for.
Right.
Tree huggers out, Odin worshippers in.
But are all religions entitled to the same degree of respect, or should protection only be afforded to those with significant numbers of followers? We can't just have anyone claiming to be right about everything, can we?
There's such a variety of veneration going on all around the world that it can be difficult, if not impossible, to grant all religious worshippers the same credence. They've all found ways of making their own holy magic, from fondling snakes to swimming in their clothes, from falling over to vigorous interpretive dance. Alan Moore is a writer and magician from Northampton. He's a stranger to hairdressers and worships his very own God in his very own way, blurring the lines between religious belief, magic, and the power of the creative imagination. If you film him from strange angles, you can make him look very sinister. But he isn't really.
Hello, mate. Could I have a cup of tea, please? Black tea.
Alan's familiar on his journey of faith and worship is an ancient Roman glove puppet snake called Glykon.
Well, actually, I just thought he looked gorgeous. He looked so smug. And he'd got this kind of these lidded eyes and this superior expression, which I identified with in a certain way.
Yeah.
And also, like I say, it's just the absurdity of this limbless serpentine body and this Paris Hilton head on top of it. It's irresistible. He's certainly the coolest, most rock and roll looking god that I have ever seen. I just fell in love at first sight.
You've not chosen to worship Paris Hilton, though, by extension?
No, I've certainly not.
No.
It's sort of... I mean, there are limits, you know, even to somebody who's worshipping a hairy snake, you know. I mean, I'm not going to go mad here.
What's in it for you, though, following Glykon?
I believe that every single individual human being should probably make their own peace with the universe. I mean, we're all of us different emotionally, we're all different physically, intellectually. It would be really odd if we were all the same spiritually. So, I mean, that's why I have a problem with religion, per se, because religion, the very word, it comes from the same root word as ligature and ligament, and it means to be bound together in one belief, which I find a bit creepy and a bit unnatural.
How did you first go about worshipping Glykon, and what form does the worship take?
Well, when I started to become interested in magic, I understood that everything that people talk about with regard to magic is all absolutely true, as long as you understand that it is happening inside people's minds. And it struck me that that must be what magic is. It must be like treating the space that we perceive inside our minds as a kind of territory. And I thought that working on that hypothesis, you could explore that territory.
You can't have that conversation with a Christian fundamentalist.
I mean, religious fundamentalism, I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer, because if you actually look back at the foundations of Christianity, you find that the thinking is a lot more flexible.
Yeah.
The kind of what we call fundamentalism these days is basically entirely based upon 1930s tent show revivalism.
Right.
It goes back no further than about 80 years. And yet it's a very frightening and dangerous mindset, because, I mean, as far as I understand it, at the moment, there are genuine worries that, certainly in America, that this could actually negate science, it could drag us back into a new dark ages.
Yeah. And it informs policy.
Absolutely.
Well.
Well, I mean, if you've got sort of self-confessed fundamentalists at the top seats of government, that surely kind of threatens the separation of church and state, you'd think.
Keeping religion out of politics is still considered good form, at least in Britain it is.
You don't pray together, for example?
No, we don't pray together, Jeremy, no.
Our Prime Minister may not like to talk about how his faith informs his politics, but his friend George has no such misgivings. He starts each day at the White House with a Bible class.
What would be the policies of a nation marching under the flag of Glykon?
The name means, apparently it means sweetie.
Oh, really?
It's really nice. Yeah, he's just called Sweetie. I suppose that sweetness and good hair would be the main qualities that I'd look for and enlightenment.
And they're all qualities which you embody.
Absolutely, and the smugness as well. I'd like to see a bit more of that around.
Whether you worship a puppet snake or a man from Bethlehem who could make a loaf feed more people than it could reasonably be expected to, somehow, in an increasingly multicultural, multi-faith society, we're all going to have to learn to get on. So why is it that government initiatives seem designed to increasingly segregate children on the basis of their parents' religious beliefs?
The public are opposed to discriminating against children on the basis of their religion or their parents' religion, pretend or otherwise, and opposed to the segregation of children on racial and religious grounds that causes. So there's an overwhelming majority against that, but we have an extremely conservative government that thinks that it's a good thing to do despite that, because it wants to keep well in with the faith.
Well, I'm delighted to have the opportunity today to pay tribute to FaithWorks and the work which you as churches and Christian organisations undertake in communities up and down the country.
The decision to not just permit faith schools, but to actively promote them, comes from on high.
I know why they did it. I mean, partly because, not just because Tony Blair is himself religious and sends his children to religious schools, but David Blunkett, who I think isn't particularly religious, said when he was Education Secretary, I'd like to bottle the magic that faith schools have. Yeah. What he meant is he saw faith schools being very orderly, often in very poor areas. Faith schools often have, the best behaved kids. They quite often have better results. Because they screen out the chaotic families, by definition.
They're operating a different sort of selection procedure, so you're not obliged to have to deal with pupils or families that might bring your batting average down, basically.
Absolutely. They're not going to be the families of drug addicts and of depressives and people with serious problems, alcoholics and all the rest of it. So they end up being what's called the best schools. Yeah. That's because they've got the good kids. And ministers mistake that and think there's some magic about the fact it's religious. The only magic is selection.
And while the majority of British people have left religious belief behind, the chances of our children avoiding having faith presented to them as fact are slim and getting slimmer. Hamish Renfrew, a parent and non-believer, had to ask his child's school to allow her to skip religious education. He encountered resistance to his attempts to question the way religion was taught as an unconditional truth at her school, and was disappointed that non-belief was not an educational option. He now campaigns on behalf of the National Secular Society.
First term, 4.5 years old, I get back a piece of paper which says, under knowledge and understanding, I think a kind of inappropriate title, in RE, the children will learn the importance of baptism with a capital B.
Right.
I am unbaptised. My wife is unbaptised. My daughter is unbaptised. And unless she chooses to change her mind as an adult, will remain so.
What's wrong with teaching them about baptism, per se, though? I mean, it's part of social traditions.
I agree. There's nothing wrong in teaching baptism as a function done by certain people in a certain religion. But that's not what this was. This was the importance of baptism with a capital B. We're talking George W. Bush and his cohorts here. I've worked in Texas and other southern states. I've seen those kind of Baptists. Right. And they scare me witless.
A lot of people feel the same. A lot of parents are very distraught when they find in their area they may have a choice between two different faith schools, as Catholic, a Church of England, maybe in some areas a Muslim school, or between a girls' school and a boys' school, and they don't have a chance of what most people want, which is a mixed, non-denominational school.
I have no religion. I consider myself undiluted. Now, there is no teaching of the fact that you don't have to have religion. It's rather like soccer. It's which team do you support, not do you like soccer. Do you care?
I get very fed up with that presumption, particularly from cab drivers, if there's any watching.
Well, this is the problem, and I think the problem for the politicians is that if you are a Manchester United supporter or a Chelsea supporter, and we can appeal to that caucus, you'll vote for me.
Right.
If you're Church of England or Islam or whatever, you've put yourself in a box that the politicians can drag where they want you to be. They don't have to address individuals who can think for themselves. And I think individuals who can think for themselves is probably the biggest fear that a modern politician has.
What really disturbs Hamish is that when religion is taught in school, the line between reality and make-believe, fact and faith, is often blurred.
At Christmas, my daughter, 5, is doing a Christmas play. It was the night before Christmas. They called me into the school. They gave me the script. said, no, take it home, check everything, make sure that you're comfortable with it. I said, it's fine. It's a play. It's pretend. When she's 14, if you want to cast her as Lady Macbeth, I won't actually think you're getting her to incite someone to murder. It's a play. And she said, well, you're being very reasonable about that. But we tried a couple of years ago to do something for Diwali, and we had Christian parents in saying, I'm not having my child use those words, say those things. And because of that experience, we have to run this past you. That's the sort of censorship that's happening in this. That's the kind of crush of any sort of non-religious viewpoint that I object to so strongly.
Don't you think that that there should be religious education of some sort in schools? Because it's partly, that would partly help to diffuse any problems if people at least understood each other's cultures.
Oh, religious education is very important. And for one thing, just for cultural reasons. But how could you understand Jerry Springer the opera unless you knew the stories?
But it is weird getting accused of blasphemy. I don't know if any of you have ever been formally accused of blasphemy. But I'm always relieved when people laugh at that idea, because everywhere around the country, hey, I don't know if any of you have ever been accused of blasphemy. People go, no, it'd be ridiculous. Except in Bilf Wells. And if you know that, it's kind of...
Don't imagine that my contribution to Jerry Springer the Opera means I'm against all aspects of religion. I don't think you should throw the baby out with the bathwater, especially if you're babysitting. And there are few better tools for understanding human experience than the rich heritage of stories, like the Christian myth seen here, handed down to us by the world's faiths. Why is it important, then, to be allowed to comment on, criticise and, yes, laugh at religion? At best, religions have inspired some of the greatest music, literature and art in history, and provided a mythopoetic framework for our finest ideals, hopes and values. At their worst, religions have been used to excuse the most vicious aspects of human nature, legitimising persecution, genocide, slavery and war. When religions embody immorality and irrationality, they must be open to criticism.
Communities often are silent about some of the bad things that happen inside them. And once you close down the open debate, you in fact inhibit, particularly women, from coming forward to speak about bad things that are done to them. So I'm very against the idea that somehow we close down debate in respect for religion, because I actually think religion, like every other belief system, has to be out there to be examined, and to be examined in some of the ways that it does bad things to others.
I don't think that I should be censored from going into areas that some people may find offensive if I have a very good and coherent argument for why it's okay to do it.
So here we are back where we started, looking at Christians protesting about Jerry Springer the Opera in Liverpool. The right to stage a comic opera which allegedly features Jesus in nappies but never actually has done ever may seem like a fairly trivial issue. But it has implications as to the extent to which we're prepared to accommodate the views of people who draw their inspiration from faith.
This production not only undermines the authority of God, but it undermines the divinity of the Godhead.
In an increasingly complex world, perhaps it's better to look towards more tangible certainties. It may seem like reckless behaviour, but wouldn't it be nice to dream of a society where belief was no obstruction to dialogue?
You know what they say? Some things in life are bad. They can really
In 1979, the British Board of Film Censorship ruled that 14-year-olds could see The Life of Brian, agreeing that the average teenager could tell the difference between provocative satire and gratuitous insult. Nearly 30 years later, are we really going to let the new Puritans do our thinking for us? In the meantime, if it all gets too much, don't grumble, give a whistle, and this will help things turn out for the best. And
always look on the light side of life.
Not quite the bright side. Next tonight, a look back at the ice storm that devastated Montreal. A perfect disaster, or is there worse still to come?